Well, I was thinking this week of an incident that happened maybe 35 years ago when I was at Irvington meeting pastoring, and they got it in their mind, all the Quaker bigwigs, that it would be a wise idea to get all of the Quaker pastors in America, all 12 of us, together, and somehow in the midst of all this planning, it was decided that they would put the evangelical friends in charge of it, which meant all the speakers were evangelicals who did their best to get us all whipped up, and so our meetings would grow and Quakerism would be saved. So Joanne and I flew down because it was in Orlando and it was wintertime, and that's when I began to realize the value of a flexible theology. Orlando in the winter. Yes, I can do that. Now, Joanne, being smarter than me, spent the time at the pool reading books. And I attended the meetings, and it was always the same format for every meeting. We'd listen to a speaker, as one does at these things, and then we would break into small groups to discuss what had been said. One of the speakers spoke about the importance of confession as a spiritual practice. So when our small group gathered, one of the pastors, a not very bright man, with his wife seated beside him. You see this coming. Confessed to being attracted to a woman in his congregation. So a friend of mine was seated next to me, a fellow pastor, a bit of a scallywag, who I really enjoy. So he was sitting beside me, he was taking notes and scribbling something furiously on his notepad, then slid it over to me very discreetly. He had written these words, "I don't believe I'd have told that." And I was thinking the exact same thing. Too much information. So that same friend, the one with the notebook, reads my messages each week, and I read his. And this past week, reacting to my confession of being a functional atheist for my adult life, for much of my adult life, which I mentioned last week, he sent me an email saying, "I don't believe I'd have told that." And he wasn't the only one. In fact, several people said the same thing to me. One woman wanted to know what I meant by the phrase functional atheist. And I told her it meant I had more doubts about God than certainties, more questions than answers. She said, "How can you be a pastor if you have doubts and questions?" She wasn't being mean, she was just curious about how that would work. And I said, "Well, I'm kind of curious about how it works too." It was a great question. In most denominations and religions, clergy are expected to deal in certainties. I think we kind of assume that they've made up their minds about things, are expected not just to believe in God, but to believe the right things about God and affirm the orthodox teachings of the church. We're supposed to hold up our end of the things. That's kind of the implied agreement that we have. Quakers, though, approach faith very differently, which is what I want to talk about this morning. As we consider those things that early Quakers got just right. We spent 6 Sundays talking about the things that maybe we should have given a little more thought to. So now we're reflecting on the things the early friends got just right, one of which was this. Early friends never expected someone to believe something they hadn't personally experienced. That is really important. Early friends never expected, never required, never demanded that anyone believe anything they hadn't personally experienced. At the heart of Quakerism is the belief in the primacy of what George Fox called knowing experimentally or experientially, by which he meant our ability to have a first-hand experience of the divine, and that our first-hand experience of God comes in its own time, at its own pace, and could never be forced into human constructs or schedules. The Spirit blows where it will. Hence your story this morning. The Spirit blows where it will. I can have all kinds of theories about healing and be fairly certain in my mind that I'm right. But the Spirit blows where it will. We did not require one another to believe in someone else's experience of God or affirm someone else's revelation. We only invited one another to seek that experience for themselves, and when that experience happened, to trust it. To trust it. To trust their experience with God. Now, because of this, Quakers did not insist their leaders have that experience in order to serve. That was not a requirement for service. For they knew that experiencing God was a lifelong journey, a lifelong quest. What they did expect from their leaders was a commitment to the ongoing, unfolding search for truth. So I was never asked to believe in God. I was only asked to seek God, to seek truth, which has been the basis of my pastoral ministry, this lifelong quest for seeking and discerning what friends called capital T truth. And I first experienced this when I was thinking of becoming a pastor. I think I was 21, 22. And I'd been asked by several people at Plainfield meeting to reflect on whether or not I might be useful in ministry. This shocked me because I had never thought myself useful at anything. So I was surprised at this suggestion. But I said, I'll think about that. And around that same time, I met and became friends with a Quaker pastor named Jim Furby. Karen, I think maybe he was your pastor at one time, right? Down at White Lick meeting. And Jim was much older than I was. He was in his early 80s then, winding down his ministry just as mine was cranking up. And he had been invited to bring the message one morning at Plainfield meeting. And he gave this wonderful message. It just struck me then, and still in my memory, just still resonates with me. It was just very thoughtful and loving and wise, and what he said moved me deeply. It was a clear case of the Buddhist teaching that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. At the Rise of meeting, after everything was over and we were standing around greeting one another, I made my way over to where Jim was standing, and I asked him, Jim, how long did it take you to write that sermon? You know, because I was thinking, I better know these things if I'm thinking about becoming a minister. I said, how long did it take you to write that? And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, all my life. All my life. And I have revisited that moment many times since. At first, I thought it meant his message had been the summation of everything he'd learned in his 80-odd years. And it was certainly that. But now I think it was more than that. Not just a summation of experience and knowledge, but an affirmation of lifelong seeking and the nature of wisdom itself. The nature of wisdom itself, that we can never arrive, that we can never set down our bags on truth's doorstep and say, finally, I'm here. We just can't do that. I've told you before about buying a book when I was a teenager that cost $3 and was called God's Answer for Everything. I thought at the time, what a bargain, what a deal that was. Boy, that turned out to be a waste of $3. You know the greatest threat to spiritual growth? Certainty. Conviction, certitude, the setting down of bags on truth's doorstep and announcing to the world, I have arrived. Doubts and questions are not problems to be overcome. They are gifts. Gifts. They fuel our search for truth, our quest to understand. Early friends worried far more about the true believer than the skeptic, and so created a manner of worship that focused less on settled answers and more on honest seeking, on listening, on keeping the mind and the heart and the spirit open. Their gift to us was significant, our debt to them considerable. All our lives, we engage in this search. All our lives, we seek to understand. We feel no need to claim as truth that which we have not personally experienced. We want only to be honest and open, seeking the truth wherever it leads, whomever might be teaching it, wherever it might in our lives emerge.